Okay, now I'm going to work on these like deformer rigs. Kind of how I was showing. You can go through and you can kind of rig up like any kind of object basically with bones. These are just like little skeleton. There's no joints, or there's no skeleton bones in between them. They're just joints, and they're each constrained to a controller here. And then whenever you bind them to the skin, basically you have to go and you have to kind of see each one, what kind of weights it pulls on a certain box. To me, that's pretty intense. I don't really see a point in doing all that just for like a box or like a ball or something. I have seen some tutorials do that, but you know, in all honesty, that would take just longer to rig up the skin, because basically all I've did here is I've went through, oops, I don't want to move that, move this guy here. Go to the top view here. I did a skeleton and created joints. I want to make sure you can see your joints. It's pretty small. So I need to go back and make them bigger. Let's go to 5. Well, at least it only does 2. There we go. So if you just press enter, basically now you have a joint there. Say I want to make another one. Enter. Enter. Now I have this thing where I can basically make controllers for this and constrain the controllers to the joints. This is my joint there. I'm kind of blowing through this because I know no one will probably do this. So like this is my controller here, where if I wanted this specifically to move with that, I would put the pivot point right in the middle of that joint there. Freeze the transformation on this. Constrain this to my joint. Parent constraint. So that way every time I rotated it, I'm moving the joint. And if I made one for each one of these things, after I bind the skin, you need to make sure there's subdivisions in here. Now when I go to move this, I'm moving the actual joint itself, or actually the box itself. And so then you see what I did here for this one is basically I parented 2 of these together to this controller here. Then I parented all 3 of these items to this world controller here. So I can move everything, or I can kind of move it up. That is a way to do it. Sometimes it looks good, sometimes like the more divisions you have in there, maybe the better you'll be able to kind of rotate it. But the only thing is it kind of stretches if you have a texture on there. and it makes for like basically a lot of hard animating. In other words, you need to make sure all these are kind of keyed up. It's going to kind of move as a blob unless you're kind of moving it all together. That is the way to do it. If you're just making a box bounce, which I think that's probably all it will happen, I would suggest going this route using set keys to basically drive a deformer. And you can kind of constrain everything to a world controller there. Like this one right here. You have your world controller. You have your squash and bend and controller that gives it its appeal. You can move it that way. It's only key set on the y-axis or the x-axis. So if you move it this way, you're kind of out of luck. You can go further and do that, but what I've did here is I've added 2 deformers, a squash and a bend, and I've set the key, set driven keys on coordinates of this right here. Now, how do I do this? Let me just recreate this. Let me open up another Maya scene. Put this on pause. I got my Maya scene up here. I have my box here. I'm gonna go ahead and make it like a book or like a video game unit. Need to make sure there's plenty of divisions in here. So that whenever it bends and squash it, we'll have plenty to basically squash over. So the first thing I'm going to do, since I'm going to be able to move this thing any direction, and if I were having it laid down like this, I'd be able to move it to where I could squash and stretch it basically like this. It's just easier for me to see things as a top view, especially with this, because I can always take, and put my item out like this right here and kind of make him do the inchworm if he's scooting somewhere. So in other words, if I was animating that moving, I would obviously key both of these in my initial one. My movement, S. I'll move it back. Move that right there. And I would keep both of those right there. And then I would just continue the process of kind of inching along. Obviously be a little faster. Oh well, that's for another tutorial. But what I'm going to do here is, you can set it up like this, but I'm going to knock him on his upside like that. We'll turn it 90 degrees. I'm going to set him right on 0 world. So first I'm going to create two controllers, a base controller, then we'll control duplicate, create another one. I'm going to make this one look different though, because this is my head controller. Looks pretty good like that, as long as I can kind of see it. And I'm going to move it to right here. Now these can be fudged, or they will eventually move, but as long as you got it right there. So the first thing I want to do is add a deformer. Get my modeling, a bend deformer. So now if you go over here to your curvature, you can see this thing's bending. Did I add that to the cube? Oh yeah. Make sure you have your cube selected. And you add the deformer to the cube and not the controller. Bend. It's all wrong. You got to think in terms of like when it initially added at its beginning state. I don't want this thing to rotate like that. If it were still squashed down, then it would probably work, but what you can actually do is turn the actual controller. It's good to set it to 180 uneven, and if you look in your wireframe you can see it in there now. So if you go over to your curvature here now, you can see how it's bending, and for some reason if it was bent the wrong way of that way, you can actually go in here and turn it back. Just make it how it's supposed to be. So we'll set that back to 0 because we want it bending how kind of like a slinky would bend over. But if you notice, it's coming up at the bottom. I want it to be able to kind of fold all the way over. So that means you need to kind of move the actual handle itself. So I'm going to set this back to 0. I'm going to put the move tool on it, and I'm going to look at my thing here, and I'm just going to move this thing all the way down to the solid plane right there to the ground. That way whenever nothing really seems to happen. If you set your low and down, your high bound, move my curve value, there we go. So basically what I've upped my high bound to where it actually starts bending here. See if I were to set it around. There we go. That's good. That's a full bend. That's how I want my thing to bend whenever it bends over like that. I'm going to give a solid flap basically. So that way whenever I have an animation on it, I can flip it around from that way to that way right there. Alright, I'm going to set this back to 0. Now I'm going to put a squash on it. Now if you wanted to make this controller to where you could control the bend going in the Z or the two different directions, say like this right here, make it bend this way and bend this way. Basically you would go through this process, but you would just add another bend handle and you would like curve it the other way. So you'd have two bend handles on here, but you know, that's just more. So I think we'll keep it simple right now for this. I want to put the squash on it. So I'm going to squash here. I think I added it to my curve. So let's see where this thing's at. You're going to be messing with the factor value here. And what I'm doing is just right middle mouse clicking so I can kind of, it's kind of weird looking. So I'm going to bend this thing 90 degrees, or yeah, well, it will be 180. You notice it's squashing in the middle right there. I want it to squash on the ground of this world controller, so I'm going to actually move the entire handle. So you see what my factor is. Go. I didn't really need to mess with the high bound. It's the low bound that you need to kind of subtract from. At the same time, move the actual handle down to where it kind of gives it that how low it wants to squash. But the thing is, I don't really want to affect, with this model, I don't want to affect the base where it sits on. So it will look like it's popping up, in other words. Now that's obviously extreme right there, but I'm going to set the key for that. So in other words, it always stays on the ground, a ground plane, but it's moving up, and you can move it, kind of affect the value with the factor right there. So I'm going to set it back to 0. So now what we've got to do is basically somehow drive these values with this controller right here. Now you could go and you could add an attribute. Of a value, but then you'd have to be going up here to kind of scale 1 to 10 every time, however long. I just think it's easier just to do a key driven. So what I'm going to do is, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this history on these controllers, and I'm going to freeze the transformation on both of them. And that's important because that way you can always return back to this value if you press 0 over here. Now I'm going to label these things. This is my deformer control. This is my world control. This is a tiny rig, so you can always kind of name these things whatever you want to name them. Okay, so now basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my animation tab, set driven key. Remember the driven and the drivers. This thing here needs to be the driver. Now I'm going to control my curve. I'm going to do my curvature first. My bend controller. It's going to move if you go to your bend. It's going to move back and forth like that. That's going to be on the x-axis, the translate. So my driven, I'm going to load my driver, deform control. I'm going to need my translate x. Now I'm going to be, my driven is going to be my bend handle, curvature control. It's not up here, so you'll need to load the driven, load the driver, or I'm sorry, load the driven. Select this again right here. Now you select your curvature, load driven of that. So now the two selections come up here. Now you can select that's right here. So this is your driver, your translate X. The curvatures, it's going to be driving the bend handle curvature. Now I'm going to set these in states. I'm going to do this from the side view so you can I can set 3 states basically. So this is my, if I move it right there, bin handle, curvature, go all the way down over there. I'm going to set this key. I'm going to return this back to 0. I'm going to return my curvature back to 0 or to middle. We'll set a key. Now I'm going to move this back to where I think however far I want it to bend. So my curvature, I'm going to bend it over there. I'm going to set that key. So what I've just did is I've set 3 states. Kind of a middle and extreme, and then a far. So if I were to move this, it just moves this flap now. And if I want to return it back to 0, it returns everything to 0. Now the same thing needs to happen with the squash. Except I'm going to be moving this in the Y translate. My deform control, the Y, that's my driven, load my driver. I need to be loading, this is my driven, squash handle, my factor, right there. So now I'm going to do this the same way. I'm going to use the side. First I'm going to see what my extreme squash will be. I think that looks good right there. Now I'm going to move this on top of it right there. My driver, my deform control, the translate Y, is driving the squash factor. Key it. Move this back to 0. Move my factor back to 0. And we'll key this state. Now I'm going to move it up. I say that's good right there. It can be a little, it doesn't have to be perfect with it. I like to keep it perfect, so oops. My driver, translate Y, squash factor. We'll set this key. So now I've just set 3 more states for the up. So if I remove this, I can move it up, I could squash it, I can bend it, move it down, kind of starts taking different shapes. Now if I wanted to move this thing this way, I would have had to add another bin handle in there, and I would have had to set a state like that separately, and I would have named that bin handle 2. Now to kind of clean up so it doesn't look like it kind of oversees or oversteps the, I like to go into the animation editor. I'm just going to set these things to tangent. Just give it a more exact. Now I need the rigorous task of grouping all this stuff together. It's pretty easy. I have everything labeled over here. This will be my geometry box, whatever it is. I need to be able to actually group all this stuff together and then parent this so I can actually kind of turn this, because you know, nothing happens. Obviously you just can't parent this to this and it's going to work. You want to be able to hook a scale to it too. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to group all this stuff right here together except the world control. So I'm going to control G. This is my box. Now I'm going to select the box rig. First of all, I'm going to make sure this is delete history on this. And the transformation is frozen on this one. So I'm going to select my group. Go to my constrain, parent constrain. See if that works. Nope, I did it backwards. Select my world control, then my box. Now I can move this anyway. And while I got it like that, I'm going to put a scale constraint on it. So if I want to make this thing bigger, the entire rig will scale. So now any way I move this here rig, this box, I can kind of move this controller here. And it's going to move on me. So if he's laying on the ground, -90. You can select these deformers and turn them off, so you don't ever grab them or anything. Because the only thing you really want to be grabbing is this right here. So now you kind of start animating. You'll just need to maybe make a key selector and select both of these things. Hit S. We go a few frames. Stretches out. Join. Just need to make sure you select both of them whenever you are keyframing. I didn't do it there. I'm going to select that one. Never really tried to do inchworm. I'm going to set this back to move them along, and then just have fun animating the box. You can make him bounce up and down, turn around, do some circles, however you want to do it. Okay, hope this helps. This is a basic box rig with deformers. Like I said, you could use skeletons, bones. They're a little bit more intense when it comes to animating, keeping up with your keyframes. But it can be done. There's a number of different ways to do it. I think this, on the long term, though, if you make your make right controllers, it's a little bit easier to keep up with. Can look a lot better, but it's a lot more keyframing. So, okay, hope this helps. Bye.